Lecture 13, July 2, 1959 Constituens and Constitutum. In the last few lectures we have been preoccupied with the problem of subject and object, and specifically with the problem of the subjective mediation of objectivity in commune philosophy. The situation we have now arrived at is one in which the concept of a knowable object has been eliminated, while on the other hand Kant wishes to escape from the idea that our knowledge is no more than a mere duplication of the subject. You will now wish to know what criteria he uses in the definition of objectivity. I believe I had already told you something of these criteria, at the very beginning, when I was discussing the concept of synthetic a priori judgments, or at least, I gave them to you in the form in which they are to be found in Kant 1. However, I think we have now reached the point where we need to consider these criteria a little more closely, particularly since, if I understand the situation rightly, this leads us to the heart of one of the central problems of the critique of pure reason, one that we have not really discussed as thoroughly as it deserves. I am talking about the problem of constituens and constitutum. To give you the key words, the criteria Kant gives for synthetic a priori judgments and thus for genuine, valid knowledge with a substantive content, are the concepts of necessity and universality, universality and necessity. Now if you look these terms up in the Critique of Pure Reason to see how they are defined, you will be sure to be disappointed. The fact is that you will not find all that much said about these concepts. Kant does not discuss at length what is meant by universality and necessity. To anticipate my general thesis about these terms, let me begin by saying that they illustrate in exemplary fashion what I have already said about the externality of Kant's concept of knowledge, although I would ask you not to misunderstand me on this point. What I mean is that by knowledge he thinks of the ordering and classifying of something, subsuming it under laws and rules, without its ever being made explicit what this something is. As far as the concept of necessity is concerned, the first criterion of absolutely valid knowledge in Kant, I would ask you to look in the chapter on the systematic representation of all the synthetic principles of pure understanding, that is to say, the point where the synthetic judgments are inferred from the deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, and following on from the postulates of empirical thought. We learn there that this concept of necessity is thought of exclusively as coming within the parameters of the law of causality. Every other concept, for example, that of a necessity of thought or necessity as an internal motive, or as a necessity that follows from the nature of a thing, every other concept is actually excluded by Kant from his idea of necessity as something that acts as a guarantee of knowledge. Here is the relevant passage. Necessity concerns only the relations of appearances in conformity with the dynamical law of causality and the possibility grounded upon it of inferring a priori from a given existence, a cause, to another existence, the effect, point 2. In other words, then, that externality of which I have told you holds good even for the concept that is most powerfully opposed to it in the philosophical tradition in general, namely, the concept of necessity. For if we regard something as necessary we doubtless also have causality in mind, but when we reflect on it we really always think of something more. Thus when we say that crises are a necessary part of the capitalist system, we do not really mean to say that a specific causal sequence at particular points necessarily leads to the symptoms of crisis. What we mean is that the system as such, with its mutually conditioned growth of wealth and poverty, necessarily contains the idea of recurrent crises in its actual concept. that this externality is really involved here emerges with even greater clarity from a passage in the first version of the deduction of the pure concepts of understanding. Thus the concept of a cause is nothing but a synthesis of that which follows in the time series, with other appearances. According to concepts. And without such unity, which has its a priori rule, and which subjects the appearances to itself, no thoroughgoing, universal, and therefore necessary, unity of consciousness would be met with in the manifold of perceptions. 3. I have already told you about the peculiar ambiguity of the unity of consciousness. 4. And I would draw your attention to the fact that here, once again, it is to be taken in its objective sense. That is to say, Kant speaks of the unity of consciousness in appearances, in the manifold of perceptions. In other words, the unity of consciousness is not just something in me, but is always and at the same time present in the experiences concerned, because the experiences, the appearances, are in truth always only mine, that is, they are mediated through me. But that is by the by, and I mention it because the passage very strikingly documents once again the ambiguity of the central concept of unity in the manifold, and because I attach the very greatest importance to this point where subjectivity and objectivity meet in Kant. But what we should be focusing on here is something else. This is that because of the nature of our thought we can do no other than subject successive events to such a rule. But our thoughts are incapable of telling us anything about what might be called the internal interconnections linking these events that succeed one another in time, aside from the form of our act of subsumption. You see here with great clarity the sense in which the subjectively constituted objectivity Kant intends is really no more than an epiphenomenon, something imposed and external to the things themselves, as I have already explained in general terms. The classical definitions of causality can be understood entirely in the spirit of these remarks. These definitions have played a major role in all the discussions about the nature of science, and I only repeat them here to make sure that you really understand this Kantian concept of causality. Let us take, for instance, the concept of cause, which signifies a special kind of synthesis, whereby upon something, A, there is posited something quite different, B, according to a rule. It is not manifest a priori why appearances should contain anything of this kind. In other words, he is not looking into the different elements that are connected by causality. It is in this strict sense that we must speak of the externality of causality. For experiences cannot be cited in its proof, for what has to be established is the objective validity of this a priori concept. Thus once again he makes a virtue of a necessity. On top of that, the fact that no internal motivation can be discovered in appearances is then credited to the objectivity of the concept of causality, as is generally his practice. This is because he says, well, if this necessity arose simply from the appearances, from the given in its constantly changing nature, then it all might be different. But because it is located in the a priori conditions of our knowledge, it simply cannot be any different. It is absolutely necessary. That is to say, the very externality, the very factor in which this classical idealist concept of causality is deficient with regard to its object, is what enables Kant to make its particular claim to objectivity. This provides backing for my thesis that in Kant the concept of objectivity is chained to the predominant power of subjectivity. For this reason it is not evident a priori why appearances should contain anything of this kind. and it is therefore a priori doubtful whether such a concept be not perhaps altogether empty, and have no object anywhere among appearances. Point 5. The criticism he makes here is the same criticism as Hume makes of the traditional concept of causality. 6. And it is one that he appropriates here to an astounding degree. There are few passages in the Critique of Pure Reason that sound as Humean as this one. But he goes on to pull himself out of the quagmire by his own hair, by inferring the objective validity of thought from the very fact that it is structured the way it is and that it is subject to this rule. In a further passage about the concept of causality, and this is the proper definition of causality in Kant, he asserts, for this concept of causality makes strict demand that something, A, should be such that something else, B, follows from it necessarily and in accordance with an absolutely universal rule. 7. If you examine this statement closely, you will notice a certain circularity. For you will recollect the other argument that I read out to you, according to which the concept of necessity was said to be meaningful only in so far as it related to causality, and now we find causality defined in terms of necessity. I do not want to make a meal of this. All the less as the two statements arise from different versions of the Critique, and we may probably assume that Kant regarded the second one as definitive. 8. However that may be, we are no doubt entitled to conclude that having once defined necessity in terms of causality and nothing else, and having defined causality as a regularity, namely a lawful progression in the nature of consciousness that brings together successive phenomena, that is to say, a form of synthesis, causality in Kant must be understood in terms of this synthesis and not in terms of something inherent in objects themselves. 9. We might almost say that these two concepts, necessity and universality, which I shall discuss in a moment, show this peculiar character of a subsumption along two axes. Causality can be placed along the vertical axis, that is, in the dimension conceptualizing the progression of events in time. For its part, the concept of universality does not express a temporal progression, but defines an object universally in terms of simultaneity. If you wish to know what Kant means by universality in the Critique of Pure Reason, you will discover even less. All you will find is the mention of it in the discussion of a priori judgments, where it is listed as the second criterion of absolutely valid knowledge. That is to say, for a universal proposition to be absolutely universal, it must not arise from experience, because there might always be a further experience that would contradict the previous assertion. Basically, it is a matter of the traditional critique of induction, of inductive statements, on the grounds that any universal proposition based on experience only applies to the phenomena or observations that have been experienced, because we can never be certain that such a proposition will not be refuted by a subsequent observation. But since, on the other hand, Kant does not wish to jettison the concept of universality, he inserts it into the nature of knowledge as such without elucidating it any further. Such an elucidation would not be difficult to supply, however. The model that the Kantian concept of universality evidently follows is that of the formation of concepts in general. Thus what Kant means by universality is simply that, taken as conceptual units, all the individual elements that contain the characteristics defined in the concept are to be included in that concept. I believe that a cursory glance at this question of the formation of concepts, a matter that is generally ascribed to formal logic, will suffice to enable us to understand the external nature of a process of conceptualization that is orientated towards universality. for this concept is constituted in terms of what we call extensional logic, that is to say, it defines the scope of the elements contained in it, while excluding meanings. Thus a concept only arises through a process of arbitrary classification in which we isolate one feature of all the available ones and base the definition on that feature, which is then supposed to fix the concept. But it is this arbitrary element, the arbitrary selection of a particular feature, instead of focusing on the thing itself, that pinpoints the element of externality that basically fails to achieve what we mean when we say that we have the concept of a thing. This idea is something that Kant no longer understands. What we generally find in him in the theory of cognition is the subsumption of things under rules, on the one hand, or under the concepts of extensional logic, on the other, instead of a comprehension of the thing itself. If you wish to gain an understanding of the conjuncture at which his successors parted company with him, then you have the reason for it at precisely this point. To put it quite simply, it is that the philosophical concept as it appears in Kant is not seriously intended to be the concept of a thing, but merely something more or less imposed on the thing from outside by the subject. I believe that what I set out to tell you about the element of externality in the Kantian concept of knowledge, together with the reference, by way of correcting that, to problems of which the problem of schematism was an example, has now been satisfied by my showing you how it actually works out in the critique of pure reason in the definition of its true object, namely the synthetic a priori judgments. And the conclusion is that the criteria of truth, namely, necessity and universality, are in reality no criteria at all of the truth about comprehending a thing, but only criteria of their correctness, that is to say, of whether we have acted correctly in the way that we have dealt with these objects, the way we have handled them. The universality of which I have told you can be described as the universality of subjective reason, a universality generated simply by the constitution of the human subject that comprehends things in this way and no other. It stands in stark contrast to the objective concept of reason such as can be found with exemplary force in traditional philosophy in the thought of Plato. For Plato ascribes a rationality to things themselves. He ascribes a /6 to things themselves, the putative objects of cognition. He then regards the task of knowledge as that of comprehending the /6 in the things themselves. He does not see it as his task to subsume the thing or things under the rules or concepts of knowledge. However, if you now inquire more closely into the nature of this universality, you come across an interesting ambiguity, one that is not made explicit in the critique of pure reason, but which is implied in the concept of universality itself. On the one hand, universal judgments must be universal in the sense that they are absolutely valid for all future experience. Kant justifies this by claiming that the mind is structured so that it is incapable of thinking in the absence of such universality, a claim, incidentally, that can be conceded, since without concepts, without abstraction, that is, without the mechanisms that he ascribes to universality, thinking is in fact not possible. In this respect he has seen quite correctly that synthesis is not possible. We really would be faced with blind intuition, as he calls it, that is to say, with non-conceptualized givens, from which concepts were absent and on which no light could be thrown. But aside from this meaning, which you will certainly not underestimate after what I have told you, the concept of universality contains a further element. This is something that comes very close to the concept of consensus, the agreement of all human beings. If Kant heard me speaking like that, he would make the sign of the cross, and it goes without saying that in the form in which I have stated it there is nothing remotely like this anywhere in the Critique of Pure Reason. If we were in a seminar now, I would be minded to ask you why Kant should be so horrified by the idea. After all that we have said here, I believe that you could all give me the answer. This is that, if this universality were made to depend on the consensus of all human subjects, this universality would be an empirical fact. It would depend therefore on the nature of these empirical individuals who would have to agree on it. And something merely empirical and dependent on chance cannot constitute valid, objective knowledge as Kant requires of universality. You can see here that the point I am leading up to is closely related to the question of constituens and constitutum. Notwithstanding all that, this concept of objectivity only makes sense if in fact it includes a consensus. The entire question of this universality and necessity too, for that matter, would lack substance unless all subjects endowed with reason, all human beings, as Kant would insist at this point, must think in this way, and unless there is a connection between the empirical nature of their minds and the mechanism of universality that is supposed to be grounded in reason. Only if all human beings must think in this way will a proposition be truly universal. What we might call this anthropological element is therefore implicit here. The huge difficulties we face here are evident, and I would like to turn to them now. Suppose for a moment that the idea that universality should be a universality for all mankind is part of its very concept. This would then imply something to the effect, and I would ask you not to misunderstand me here, that the subject that underlies this is a social subject and not just an empirical one. This means that the forms we are considering here are not the forms we perceive in the analysis of every given consciousness. It is rather the case that the forms have their universality in the fact that they are the forms of all conscious persons, if I may put it like this, and that compared to them the individual consciousness is of secondary importance. Thus in this philosophy the individual consciousness stands opposed to the social consciousness in the same ratio as the relatively accidental and particular stands opposed to necessity and its laws, to the universal which operates in accordance with rules. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant made the sustained attempt to make a very clear distinction between the subject that he made the focus of his analysis and the empirical subject. He arrived at this abstract subject, as is the case with every concept, by abstracting from a multiplicity of individual subjects. We might then say that I cannot meaningfully talk about the transcendental subject or what he calls in the prolegomena consciousness as such, if I insist on discussing just one single consciousness. For the single consciousness will never yield more than what is in it, and there is no direct evidence to support the idea that what we say about it possesses universality. Instead I have to proceed from the assumption of a multiplicity of egos, a multiplicity of consciousnesses. I would then have to compare them and leave out everything about them that is merely contingent, that is, everything that attaches to them from outside, psychologically or through some chance. In short, I would have to strip them down until I arrived at the skeleton that is universal. It will at once be objected, Kant too would have joined in the protest, that this is a misunderstanding because the transcendental subject is what makes possible the multiplicity of individual, empirical human subjects. It is precisely at this point that we encounter the difficulty and that we see that this is one of the problems in which our dialectic is grounded in Kant's philosophy. For how can I feel justified in talking about such a universality if my starting point is simply the individual subject? I have already said as much to you. But on the other hand, if my starting point is a multiplicity rather than the connections between what is immediately given in each specific, individual consciousness, then do I not just presuppose the very thing I had set out to prove, namely, something like a subjective world? Do I not simply presuppose for the entire argument the thing that has to be constituted, society, and with it an empirical reality? Kant has shown great wisdom in leaving this question unresolved. In the later version, the second version, of the Critique of Pure Reason, there are two passages where the question is raised explicitly, namely in the Transcendental Deduction and the chapter on the paralogisms, the psychological paralogisms, that is to say, the fallacies that lead to the assumption of the substantiality of the soul. In both cases Kant took the side of transcendental logic in contrast to the curious transcendental conception that is supposed to represent a third way between the alternatives of logic and psychology, a third way that in reality is the true speculative sphere. 11 No doubt we may justifiably claim that a concept like we, society, is a naturalistic concept when measured against the criteria of the Critique of Pure Reason. 12 People who wish to criticize our dialectical attempts to operate with the concept of society as a constitutive concept of epistemology really never have more than the one argument. This is that our efforts are illegitimate because philosophy has absolute priority over all social considerations, and that, on the contrary, such social questions have first to be grounded in the theory of knowledge. In consequence, so the argument goes, philosophy would relapse into pre-philosophical skepticism if it were to start talking about society. I believe that this is a vital issue, not only for the Critique of Pure Reason but for philosophy as such, so much so that I owe it to you to discuss it at somewhat greater length. The idea of subjectivity in general, that is to say, of a theory of the forms of consciousness, cannot be conceived of without consciousness itself. As we have seen, Kant says repeatedly that concepts without intuitions are empty. And he criticizes the ontological proof of the existence of God by saying that the pure concept of a thing, regardless of what properties are ascribed to it, does not permit us to infer anything about its existence. 14 When he makes these criticisms, we ought really to apply his arguments to the idea of the transcendental subject, that is, to the forms of thought as such. This amounts to saying that the idea of subjectivity cannot be comprehended in the absence of the consciousness from which it has been separated by the process of abstraction. It is a fundamental tenet, one that is constantly reiterated in idealism, in particular by Fichte, who makes the claim explicitly and with great feeling, that whatever has been abstracted from a thing, we are talking here of the concept of pure thought or an absolute subject, as it was called by the later idealists, has absolutely nothing in common with the thing from which it has been abstracted. Now it seems to me that this inference too, is just as much of a fallacy, IFL and 1. 3 ought. To follow Kant's terminology, we would have to say that it is just as much an amphibole of the concepts of reflection as any of the amphiboles that Kant had criticized. That is to say, what is at stake here is the idea that a concept of reflection, that is, a concept that is abstracted from something given by a process of thought, but which retains a link to that given, is subsequently treated as if it had absolutely nothing to do with the thing to which it referred. It is important here to make a distinction between the logical validity of abstractions, which are by their nature free of the individual elements on which the abstractions are based, and what one might call the transcendental validity of abstractions. That is to say, whether such supreme abstract concepts are valid in themselves without the necessity for the assumptions on which they are based to be imported into them once again. In other words, whether at this point where Kant's philosophy is at pains to eliminate the constituents through criticism, at this innermost point of the constituents, it comes across the very thing that it calls the constitutum. What Kant has in mind here, and we have to say that Kant is not terribly clear on this issue, is the pure I think, and this cannot be distinguished clearly from the I as actual fact. This becomes evident when we perceive the failure of all attempts to define this I think in its purity, and to steer clear of subjective expressions. You will find it impossible to imagine this I think, this ultimately constitutive problem in Kant, without some sort of one, however constituted. But the moment you start to talk of an I that thinks, you may indeed imagine it as something that is not fully corporeal or existing in time and space. Nevertheless, in order to obtain any grasp of it at all, you have to include something of what comes to mind when you think it. Without that it would make no sense at all. That is to say, it depends on factual existence. The ontological stands in need of the ontic just as much as, conversely, if we go along with the arguments of Kant and indeed of idealism in general, the ontic stands in need of the ontological. If you completely detach this I think, that is, the pure transcendental subject, from the I as actual fact, then not only does all talk of an I lose all its meaning, but it also becomes impossible to imagine what Kant means by context of consciousness or synthesis or memory or reproduction. All these categories that we encounter in Kant would lose their entire meaning. If you separate the constituents, that is, the pure consciousness through which the actual world comes into being, from the constitutum, that is, the world in its broadest sense, then the former, the constituents, cannot even be imagined without the constitutum being imagined simultaneously. 15 This point too was taken up in criticism of Kant by the later idealists. Only they solved the problem by means of a coup de main, by inventing a sort of superego. This trend starts with Fichte, a monstrous, gigantic, absolute subject which encompasses both these concepts, constituents and constitutum. According to Kant himself, it is a mistake to hypostatize what results from the process of abstraction. Yet he is guilty of this very thing in the case of the I think. On the other hand, however, the empirical self is constituted in its own right. The soul, too, may be thought of as a thing, for example, in the sense that it is subject to causality. That is to say, with the aid of psychology we can establish to which laws of cause and effect our so-called psychic lives are subject, what causal dependencies may be said to govern our drives and such like matters. Modern psychology has made great strides in the direction of the causal analysis of the empirical subject. This contradiction that I have alerted you to amounts to saying that, on the one hand, every constitutum calls for a constituents because, as we have seen in the last few lectures, mediation is involved in everything. Conversely, however, the constituens stands in need of a constitutum because without one to refer to even the most abstract and elementary forms cannot be imagined. This contradiction is one that cannot be resolved by philosophy. It must instead be comprehended in its truth. If there is a point at which the transition to a dialectical conception of philosophy is compelling, this would seem to me to be the place to start. There is no empirical self without the concept, without those elements not reducible to mere existence and objectivity. On the other hand, there is no concept, that is, no such pure I that could not somehow be reduced to an empirical self. Both of these are present in Hegel. The decisive idea that you must grasp and that I would like to convey to you today is this: I do not wish to leave you with the idea that the true constituens is not spirit, transcendental subject, but is instead something empirical, namely, society. Such an assumption would be just as misguided as the assumptions made by idealism. I believe that the misunderstandings to which we are exposed again and again in teaching philosophy lie precisely at this point. What you should learn here, and what I hope to have gone some way towards persuading you of, is nothing other than that this question of an absolute first principle is itself mistaken. There is in short neither a constituens nor a constitutum, but instead these two elements mutually produce one another in a way that can be determined but not so that the one can be reduced to the other. Moreover, the one/j the untruth, of the philosophical tradition, that is to say, the aspects of that tradition that philosophy needs to rethink radically, is located in this search for the ideal of an absolute first principle. And we should take note that to give society absolute primacy and hypostatize that is just as much an act of naturalistic hypostatization as to give absolute priority to the spirit. Next time we shall have to discuss the structure assigned to the concept we in Kantian philosophy. I would only add now that we have been discussing this entire problem more or less without too much reference to Kant, but that it makes itself felt in his constant use of the word we, of which, strictly speaking, he ought not to avail himself. Lecture 14, July 7, 1959. Constituens and Constitutum, 2. It seems to me that last time I was a little bit hasty and casual in my treatment of an idea that is in fact of central importance for the critique of pure reason. Moreover, I did not display enough of the gift of sympathetic exposition which, admittedly, Kant confessed that he did not possess either. However, Kant's confession is but a poor consolation, and for that reason I believe that I owe it to you to provide a further description of at least the fundamental ideas in the hope that you will be able to understand them, simply because I believe that they provide the key to our efforts here in general. However, since it is not my habit to repeat a lecture, I would like to structure the arguments rather differently from last time, and this may have the advantage that those of you who did after all derive some benefit from my none too well organized account will not be too bored on this occasion. Thus my starting point now is a fact to which philosophers have often taken exception and which has been a focus of criticism in discussions of the critique of pure reason. This is Kant's use of the word we, which constantly recurs whenever he talks about the faculty of cognition. I believe that you will have no difficulty in understanding the problem, for, as you know, the task the critique of pure reason has set itself is to ground, or as Kant writes, to constitute, experience, and with it the construction of an objective world. However, if I now speak of we, this obviously refers to something that is already constituted. that is to say, the faculty of cognition we are discussing here is tacitly ascribed to already existing, actual, real, human subjects, individual persons. It may be said, therefore, that Kant has already anticipated, has already presupposed, the very thing that ought to emerge from the critique of pure reason. We might wish to pass over this by assuring ourselves that this use of we is no more than a linguistic slip, but this would be a vain consolation. For at such a crucial point, one which is of pivotal importance for the structure, the innermost core, of the critique, one to which, as we have already remarked, the entire work is attached. 3. It would be reasonable to expect Kant to have chosen his words with extreme care. Such an expectation would not be excessive. Moreover, the moment you attempt to replace this we with something more precise, you will discover that this is no easy task. I would even go so far as to say that it is impossible. For the moment you start to use such expressions as the transcendental subject or the subject as such or whatever, you will see that you have uncovered a mare's nest by way of explanations and reservations that are otherwise absent from the critique of pure reason. Such a confusion would create scope for a host of conflicting interpretations. But the greatest difficulty of all, to come right to the point, lies in the fact that we cannot eliminate this we or, on occasion, this I because all the concepts that actually make comprehensible the transcendental, that is, the sphere of the constituents, the sphere through which experience is made possible, because all these concepts designed to explain the transcendental sphere refer back to something like an I, to personal consciousness. I believe, therefore, that it is better not to allow ourselves to be fobbed off with the paltry consolation that Kant, like Homer, occasionally nods off and that his use of the word we should not be taken too seriously. Instead, we should try to clarify for ourselves what is implied by this Kantian we. What strikes us first about that is what formed the subject of the last lecture, namely the concept of universality. That is to say, he commonly says we, generally in preference to I. He uses I mainly when giving specific examples, such as the famous analogy of the thalers, but not in the course of discussions of principle. Now, when he talks of we he means something universal, not the empirical individual but something prior to empirical individuals. The fact that he does this is something on which a certain evidence, a certain insight can be based. This concept of the we is simply the thing that underpins thought, it is what thinks. At bottom, it is nothing but the self-reflecting, critically reflected res cogitans, Descartes' thinking substance. If you reflect for a moment upon what takes place in the process you would call thinking, you will find, at least in the models that underlie the critique of pure reason, that is, in the propositions of pure mathematics in the first instance, that you are not essentially involved in it as an empirical person. Whereas the thing that thinks is underpinned by each and every one of us and presupposes as a possibility the existence of individuals, we are unable to conceive of any other kind of thinking. In its objective content it is not tied in any obvious way to you and me, or to any individual. Initially, at least, we do not appear to participate in any comparatively universal totality, that is to say, we do not inquire into the judgments or mental processes or conclusions, or whatever, of other people. The I that thinks, if it thinks in the strong sense of the word, not as a private individual but as the executor of a thought content. I should like to remind you of the idea that I had already referred to a number of times and which really is of central importance for the question of philosophical systems, for the proper grounding of the theory of knowledge. This is that when we utter a judgment, a synthesizing judgment, this synthesis is not simply something imposed on us arbitrarily by things external to us. Rather, 2 plus 2 must actually be 4 in order for us to be able to express the judgment 2 plus 2 equals 4. For without that synthesis the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4 could not even be thought. This element of reconstruction, of adapting ourselves to something that is the case, but which is only the case, else should almost want to say, because we adapt ourselves to it, is what defines the specific nature of the act of thinking. This experience is what is meant when people speak of the universality that is ascribed to Kant's synthetic a priori judgments and that are expressed in this we. At the same time, however, if we take it seriously enough to credit it with programmatic importance, the expression we refers to a plurality of persons. That is to say, this plural is meaningless if by this we do not mean a plurality of individuals, if it does not refer to such a plurality of individuals. Logically, there can only be a plural, the linguistic expression for plurality, if there is also an expression for singularity. Plurality is in general only meaningful as a synthesis of singularities. Unless I can conceive of an individual, an I, however constituted, all the talk of we makes no sense. Now, if you quickly confront this idea with what we spoke of previously, you will realize that faced with the mere individual, the singular, individual consciousness to which this we implicitly refers, Kant only speaks in the plural as if to redeem the individuated consciousness from its arbitrary nature. To relate it to the element of universality of which we have been speaking. But only where a distinction is made between a plurality and a singularity, a plurality of subjects and an individual subject, can such a thing as a plural be said to exist. This has far-reaching implications not just for the argument we are concerned with here, but for the critique of pure reason as a whole. For it means that if the factors or conditions relating to the transcendental, to the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments, are to be meaningfully possible, there has to be such a personal singularity, that is, a coherent, monadological consciousness in the sense of the Kantian critique. In short, without an I, and I moreover that is thoroughly individuated, there can be no such thing as the I think that accompanies all my representations. This corresponds to the development of the argument of the critique of pure reason, in particular the chapter on the deduction of the pure concepts of understanding. We are saying, then, that the unity on the side of subjectivity is the possibility of combining all my ideas. This unity, which Kant claims is the only guarantee of objectivity, is the unity of personal consciousness. What Kant understands by this combinatory process, this mechanism of synthesis, that is, the mechanism involved in combining both simultaneous and successive ideas, is possible only in the context of an individuated or, as we would say, a personal consciousness. Thus an individual consciousness is constitutive of the concept of the transcendental and hence for the concept of the constitutive factor itself. In the critique of pure reason the constitutive factor is itself constituted by such a unified, individuated, individual consciousness. The question we are discussing here has obviously always been one that the philosophical tradition has been highly conscious of and has repeatedly debated. in the idealist tradition that followed Kant, which may also be called the tradition of conceptual realism, what I have just been saying has generally encountered the objection that we are just talking here about the form of personality. In other words, the universal element that I have described to you as being characteristic of thought, this it that thinks, occurs only in the form of a single, individuated consciousness. However, in its substance, its actual content, it is still independent and hence not tied to the individual, the particular. There is something in this, and it is quite certain that Kant himself intended something of the sort. We are saying that just as we cannot dismiss the idea that synthesis points to personal consciousness, so too we cannot dismiss the idea that in the Critique of Pure Reason this personality is conceived as a form that points to plurality, universality. The synthesizing process can only thrive in the form of individuality. But the validity of this synthesis is independent of this individuation. The judgments that he calls synthetic a priori judgments are never intended as merely individual judgments. But I believe that in making this concession we should take care not to make things too easy for ourselves. We may not take the easy route of saying, well, we live in an individualistic society and the universal that resides in thought, in the T/OS, only actualizes itself in single individuals, but intrinsically it has nothing to do with these individuals and with individuation. To say this would be to gloss over the problem. I believe that some of Kant's successors, Fichte in particular, were really too superficial at this very point where they thought they were being especially deep in their attempts to evade factuality, the specific nature of individuality. This came about because they underestimated the profundity of the interconnections between the principium individuationis that furnishes the possibility of synthesis, on the one hand, and the objectivity of truth, on the other, and they failed to reflect sufficiently on that relationship. What I want to say is that it is true that in the Critique of Pure Reason Kant reflects only on the form of an individual consciousness. That is to say, on the most general facts concerning such an individual consciousness. For example, he reflects on the fact that all the experiences that form part of an individual consciousness have some characteristic in common, namely that they are the experiences, the contents of the consciousness, of this specific individual, and cannot be replaced by those of any other individual, since that would instantly invalidate the process of synthesis. Or again, he has in mind facts which are universal, but tied to the individual, facts such as memory, the reproduction of the imagination which, as I have already mentioned, represent the core of Kant's argument about the transcendental. But even if we must concede that we are not dealing here with the specific experiences of specific, individual persons, but with the universal constituents of the individual, we must nevertheless add that these universal forms would have no meaning apart from actual individuals, apart from the personal consciousness of actually existing individuals in whom this synthesizing process takes place. Thus they are only valid in so far as such a thing as an empirical consciousness actually exists. Or, to put it slightly differently, the universal forms we are dealing with here are abstractions that are intended to construct the unity of consciousness. But philosophy was in error when it supposed that it could simply cut the umbilical cord, thus separating the abstractions from the things from which they were being abstracted. It is true that an abstraction is only meaningful if it does not contain the totality of the thing of which it is an abstraction. If it were not, there would be no concepts, and abstraction would be nothing more than a dull-witted repetition of each each individual, existing thing. On the other hand, however, the validity, and hence the substantiality, of every such abstract concept must always be related to the thing from which it has been abstracted. This applies with particular force here. It means that only where an actual empirical consciousness exists can we speak of a transcendental consciousness. Kant developed these ideas very incisively and with great force in the Amphibole chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason, in particular in the great note on the concept of Amphibole. It is very remarkable that it did not occur to him that his critique of amphiboles, that is, his critique of the confusion between the abstractions and the things themselves, also applied to his own doctrine of the transcendental. I cannot deny myself the pleasure of reading out to you a few sentences from his argument. He talks here of the concepts of reflection, and by these he means the supreme intellectual concepts, that is, the concepts that are known only through the intellect, as opposed to intuition and experience, concepts to which Leibniz and Wolff ascribe being in itself. The absolutely inward nature of matter, as it would have to be conceived by pure understanding, is nothing but a phantom, and here you have the justification, Kant's apologia, for what I described to you in one of the recent lectures as the element of externality in the Critique of Pure Reason, without, incidentally, any desire to belittle it, for matter is not among the objects of pure understanding, and the transcendental object which may be the ground of this appearance, that is to say, the celebrated thing in itself that we call matter, is a mere something of which we should not understand what it is, even if someone were in a position to tell us, for we can understand only that which brings with it, in intuition, something corresponding to our words. 5. But if this is true, it must hold good for the categories, and above all for the hierarchy of categories that Kant developed. That is to say, we can only speak meaningfully of an I if it refers to an actual empirical consciousness. At this point in the Amphibole chapter, Kant advances beyond the critique of reason, in what we might call the critical spirit, particularly in the passage where he talks of the concept of the I, the relation of sensibility to an object, and what the transcendental ground of this objective unity may be, are matters undoubtedly so deeply concealed that we, who after all know even ourselves only through inner sense and therefore as appearance, can never be justified in treating sensibility as being a suitable instrument of investigation for discovering anything save always still other appearances, eager as we yet are to explore their non-sensible cause. 6. I believe that here we have to be more Catholic than the Pope, that is to say, more Kantian than Kant, if we are to arrive at the imminent necessity of a dialectical conception of philosophy. The fact is that Kant is inconsistent here, and I would say that this is not one of the famous contradictions that the schoolmasters take note of, but rather a kind of pause in the argument which, however, we cannot accept. Thus, with regard to external meaning, he scorns to say anything definite about things in themselves. But at the point I have just read out to you, he assumes such an extremely radical agnosticism about the things in themselves that, if we were to take him at his word, he would not even be able to employ the concept of things in themselves. But when it comes to the I think, in contrast to the inner meaning, that is, to what we can know about things in the shape of appearance and not as things in themselves, he speaks as if he were talking about the thing on which appearance is grounded. I believe that this is the cardinal point, and I should like to repeat it so that you all understand it. According to Kant, The transcendental sphere is supposed to provide the foundation of the connections between the phenomena, relations in general, by means of which we have such things as a world and experience. This sphere is the legitimizing reason for the very existence of such a thing as appearance. But likewise, according to Kant, in particular the very thesis from the Amphibly chapter 1 have just read out to you, we have knowledge of such matters only in the shape of phenomena, of appearance. The pure I think, the absolute I, the secret basis for the establishment of these connections or of this process of synthesis, is just as deeply concealed as the transcendent, that is, as the transcendent thing in itself. When it comes down to it, Kant had no right to speak undialectically of such things existing in themselves, of such fixed forms given to us in reality once and for all. Instead, when he states that the world only comes into existence by virtue of the connections that are contained in these transcendental factors, these hierarchies of consciousness, he should really add that these hierarchies only exist and we only know of them because we have appearances, because we have phenomena. In other words, what Kant calls the constitutive sphere, the constituents, should not be made into an absolute, any more than should the constitutum. In the case of the latter, Kant had shown that so-called naive realism would in fact lead to inconsistencies and meaningless statements. To fail to make a comparable argument in the case of the constituents is to succumb once more to the very pitfall he had unearthed in Leibniz and exposed so incisively. It is to succumb to the amphibly of the concepts of reflection, in other words, the confusion between abstract concepts and what they represent, what they refer back to, just as truly as these references point back to those concepts. In other words, then, the concept of the transcendental, that is, all the elements through which something like experience may be said to arise, the so-called constituents of our consciousness, are none of them directly known to us, as you might have inferred from the analysis in the deduction of the pure concepts of understanding. They are rather mediations, the abstractions of a specific element of cognition, and this element is then hypostatized in the critique of pure reason. Kant does exactly the same thing with the I think that he so rightly criticizes in the Amphibly chapter in the case of the ontological employment of the concept of being, the concept of matter and all those other naturalistic concepts. The fact is that when I use the expression I think, I cannot dispense with the I, and this is reflected in Kant's linguistic usage, which was our starting point. It proves that if our somewhat long-winded discussions are persuasive, the I is not the pure, valid and thus already constituted logical form. With this I touch on a point at which I cannot avoid a disagreement with my otherwise greatly esteemed colleague Wilhelm Sturmfels. You will constantly hear him polemicizing against psychologistic interpretations of Kant with the argument that the transcendental is actually nothing more than the purely logical. In my view, this is a primitive reduction of Kant and just as much a simplification as the psychologistic view that was so prevalent in the 19th century. It is my belief that you will only understand the deeper problems at the heart of the critique of pure reason if you can free yourselves from this interpretation. If it were actually true that the sphere of the transcendental involved no more than logical unity, an idea of conformity to the laws of thought that, incidentally, presupposes thought and refers to it, if it were really nothing more than that, then Kant would surely have not taken the trouble to insist, in the introduction to the transcendental logic, on the distinction between a merely formal logic and a transcendental logic, that is, a logic that relates to objects and is for that reason bound up with objects at a far deeper level. I should like to draw your attention here to section 2 of the introduction to the transcendental logic, where he distinguishes transcendental logic from logic in general or formal logic. He says there that if matters stood as the above interpretation implies, and if it were therefore possible to dismiss the problem of a logic relating to objects simply by formalizing it, then, so Kant maintains, formal logic would also treat of the origin of the modes in which we know objects. Whereas general logic has nothing to do with the origin of knowledge. 8. The critique of pure reason is an investigation that is concerned essentially with the origin of knowledge, and not with the laws that govern the modes of knowledge that have already been crystallized and have become established. As a genetic question, as a question concerned with origins, it does nor move within the parameters of a purely formal logic, but rather in a realm which is designed to ground the phenomenal, the world of objects, even though at the same time, in order for it to exist at all, it must relate to that world of objects. I believe that you can grasp this most easily. I want to insist on this point because I believe that it really does form the innermost core of the critique of pure reason, if you reflect for a moment upon the concept of spontaneity. By spontaneity I mean the activity, more particularly the involuntary activity, as which Kant conceives of thought, as opposed to mere intuition. For this spontaneity is something that we really cannot predicate on a purely logical entity. It is quite impossible for us to imagine how a purely logical entity that has no content, no thing that can function, nothing that is over and above a pure abstraction, might generate an activity of any sort, no matter how intellectualized the concept of activity might be, unless, that is, we wish to ascribe to Kant the kind of metaphysical view that he would have called spiritualism and repudiated in no uncertain terms. It is impossible, then, to imagine anything active in a pure concept, and the concept of an entity is a pure concept. It is possible to subsume something under such an entity, but an entity qua entity creates nothing, has no function and brings nothing about. But this element of bringing something about, of activity, is contained phenomenologically in the I think that accompanies all my representations. And if I did not possess the consciousness of such an I do, then there would be no such thing as an I think that accompanies all my representations. It is in this circumstance that we see why the transcendental form depends on an element of content, however sublimated, however abstract, as the precondition of its possibility and vice versa. Kant would no doubt concede that it, that is the transcendental form, can only generate valid judgments where it relates to intuitions, that is in fact the content of the critique of pure reason. But what we are doing here, the argument we are pursuing here, goes beyond this in important respects. It asserts nothing less than that quotidian existence, factuality, is just as much a precondition of the possibility of thinking about mere forms as is its claim that without these forms the contents of experience could not come about at all. This brings us to what I described last time, I believe, as the quid pro quo in the concept of the transcendental. 9. The quid pro quo between constituens and constitutum. The reason why I am making such strenuous efforts, if I may say so, is that what is at stake here are the foundations of the philosophical position I myself uphold and that I believe I can expound in connection with these reflections on Kant. And what I would like to persuade you of is that neither of these two elements of constituens and constitutum is reducible to the other. Thus it is not my aim to demonstrate that the so-called constitutum has an ontological priority over the constituens, After everything I have said, that would not be possible. I would just like to bring you to the point where you can see that these two elements are related to each other. Remember, and I say this so that you should grasp this idea in as pointed a fashion as I can manage, that in the lectures up to now we have discussed in detail how Kant maintained that the subject is the universal, and thus is contained in every particular. I even went so far as to show you that in this sense even intuition can be thought of as conceptually mediated, not as mere immediacy. I pointed out that at this point in Kant's philosophy Hegel's later idea of universal mediation is objectively implied, even if he did not express it in this way. But I did demonstrate this to you with reference to a number of significant passages in Kant. In other words, then, and this is what we might term the official thesis, this is the Kant you will find in Baedeker: there is no constitutum without a constituens. There is no world without a transcendental subject, without an I think that accompanies all my representations. When I say that there is no world, you must understand that in principle, as Kant has already admitted, the actual, empirical subject is part of the world and belongs in this world. This means that as empirical persons we are constituta and not automatically constituents. Conversely, however, the conclusion of our analysis today is that the constituens stands in need of an individual subject as the precondition of its existence, and thus of a constitutum. Thus the very thing that is secondary according to the Kantian critique turns out to be the precondition of what is primary, just as much as the primary is its precondition. If I may for once adopt the most facile philosophical way of talking, our discussions today have provided a critique of the general thesis of idealism in tune with the Kantian system, just as, conversely, they criticize the general thesis of a so-called naive, that is, undialectical realism. If we take this really seriously, that is to say, if we regard the insolubility of this contradiction as proven, the only possible inference in my view is that we must renounce any attempt to reduce one pole of cognition to the other. In other words, we must abandon the principle of an absolute first principle to which all knowledge can be reduced. This in turn implies the impossibility of an ontology of being, both in its idealist version of the sort that thrives here in West Germany, and also the crudely materialist ontology to which dialectics have regressed in East Berlin. The question of determining the relation of these two poles to each other simply cannot be resolved by reference to so-called origins. In this way our criticism of Kant's philosophy as a philosophy of origins turns into a criticism of a philosophy of origins as such. This means that we have to abandon the search for an absolute first principle which would be the authentic, ancient truth. In other words, what I have demonstrated to you today amounts to a variation of the famous Kantian project of the critical path that alone is open. 10 We shall indeed adopt this Kantian project of the critical path. What I have been doing was very consciously carried out in the spirit of an immanent critique of pure reason. My arguments have been moving within the conceptual apparatus and the lines of thought developed by Kant. At the same time, their aim was to break out of the prison of the so-called problem of what constitutes what. They terminate in the proposition that the dialectical path alone is open. 11 Lecture 15, July 9, 1959 Constituens and Constitutum, ill. I should like to begin with a very witty remark of Dr. Schwappenhauser's following the last lecture. 1. He said that what that lecture proved was that the constituens of the constituens is the constitutum. I believe that, given the discussions we have had up to now, we can feel secure from the misunderstanding that by taking transcendental idealism at its word, my aim is to replace it with a transcendental realism, or rather, with a pre-critical, naturalistic realism or a subsequent development of such a realism. I shall have something to say about that today. However, what I attempted last time was to show you that the relationship at work here is one of reciprocity. The inference I drew from that, and which I greatly prize, is that what may be called the first principle in philosophy is not what usually goes by that name. And even more importantly, you must make the speculative leap, one that is hard to achieve, given the power of tradition of renouncing the need for any such concept as a first principle in philosophy. Incidentally, I would like to add at this point that all philosophy of first principles, all first philosophy, all prima philosophia, as we are accustomed to using the term, following Aristotle's TTPWTRJRPTORP, is idealism, whether it likes it or not. For in the light of our discussions of the way in which knowledge is universally mediated, the assumption that we can discover such an ultimate, conclusive principle on which everything else can be based necessarily implies the claim that whatever exists, whatever forms the object of philosophical investigation, will be reducible to a single principle. Only if we proceed from the assumption that our thinking is adequate to the task of discovering such an absolute foundation will we be able to discover one and assert that it is the absolute. In this sense, even so-called metaphysical materialism can be said to be an idealism in terms of its form. This idealism in terms of its form is no mere formality. A whole series of the features of idealism, and even idealist /J avud, fallacies, keep cropping up in such philosophies. We might mention such ideas as wholly self-consistent systems, complete deducibility, all-inclusive coherence, and so on. Now, after the arguments I sought to present you with during the last two lectures, you might wish to raise the following objection, an objection concerned, one might say, with the economy of thought. You might say that these are the worries of philosophers. They tear one another apart for the sake of slight nuances that can barely be understood. For when it comes down to it, why does Adorno insist on the reciprocity of constituens and constitutum in this way? Why does he deny the existence of an absolute first principle? After all, that's more or less what the priest, namely Kant, says too. That is to say, we are told countless times in the Critique of Pure Reason that the transcendental conditions of knowledge yield knowledge only if they are applied to the contents of experience. Is there really such a terribly great difference from what Mr. Adorno is telling us in such a complicated and difficult manner? As when he tells us, for example, that the constituens is a precondition of the constitutum and vice versa. Well, I would wish to reply to this by saying, and this is a remarkable feature of philosophy that has never been properly investigated and that has never really been reflected upon as it deserves, that the great distinctions, the distinctions that really matter, are always concealed in the most minute details. The two philosophical systems of Kant and Hume are generally considered to be starkly opposed to each other. It is my belief, however, that if you were to expound them to an unprejudiced observer, he would say that there is no very great distinction between the claim that objectivity is constituted by the interaction of subjective conditions and the claim that these are mere conventions. But that is not really the issue at stake. After all, When Kant says that, since our knowledge is subjectively conditioned, it can tell us nothing about things in themselves, this is not actually too terribly far away from Hume. Nevertheless, in terms of their mood, their intellectual horizons, these two philosophies are radically different from each other, as we are right to infer from the concepts of skepticism, skeptical empiricism, on the one hand, and transcendental idealism on the other. The two philosophies breathe an entirely different atmosphere. I may perhaps be allowed to interpose a comment here that is quite indispensable for an understanding of philosophy. This is that it is not a matter of the literal appropriation of the tenets of particular systems. We do not have to take them absolutely literally just as they appear on the page of the text. In certain circumstances the same concepts, the same tenets, may express quite different experiences, if I may be allowed to borrow this emphatic concept of experience from our discussions. Even where the form of words is identical in different philosophies, it may have quite different meanings. An example is when Spinoza seems simply to adopt the identical concept of God that Descartes had used, but then interprets it differently, namely as infinite substance. And what we then have is not just a different definition of the Cartesian conception of God, but a completely different, mechanistic and materialist, philosophical climate. However, in order to specify these differences, and this is the problem I wish to bring to your attention, you need an insight into minute distinctions. An instance is the distinction I have drawn between my elaborate deduction of the necessity of dialectical interpretation and Kant's own transcendental logic. It is only if you really scrutinize the subtlest nuances of the ideas involved that you can truly obtain a grasp of the whole, and this is whereby Warburg's claim that God is in the detail really comes into its own. You must realize that in the spirit of what I said the day before yesterday, the proposition that the forms do not exist without the constitutum, that strictly speaking without the constitutum you can no more speak of them than you can of the constitutum without the forms, that this means a fundamental change in the problem of constitution. The nuance of meaning we are examining here is not that the forms stand in need of the constitutum in order to be satisfied and hence to produce truth, but that the conditions of the possibility of transcendental forms are the very elements that are said to be constituted by those forms. This seemingly difficult nuance of meaning, which I can only hope that you have understood as completely as I hope I have presented it to you, this nuance means a fundamental change in the problem of constitution. That is to say, the concept of a first or fundamental principle, a fundamental philosophy, and this applies to Kant as much as to Aristotle or Descartes or any other traditional philosopher. This concept has been dissolved. The entire procedure may be thought of as residual. Philosophers believed, and this started as far back as Plato, that by eliminating the ephemeral, the accidental and more or less external you would then arrive at the pure concepts, which would be a residue that is left behind, and you would thus become conscious of the absolute, the truth, and the authentic. However, should it turn out that on examining these residual concepts you then discern within them, as if through a kind of nuclear fission, the very things that they are supposed to determine, then it will become evident that this entire method of abstracting or subtracting in the hope of being left with what is permanent and eternal, that this entire philosophical method has to be discarded. This residual theory of truth is one which includes Descartes as much as Kant, who may be regarded as a self-reflecting Cartesian. it emerges that Kant has paid his tribute to this kind of dogmatism despite his having made heroic efforts to turn it upside down. I should like now to mention something that I shall be unable to explore fully in this course, but of which I must remind you if I am to avoid confusing you. This is that this reduction of a reduction that we have undertaken, this double process of reflection, does not mean the disappearance of the distinction between subject and object. What results is not that famous night of indifference in which all cats are gray, for what ceases is merely the mutual opposition of these elements, frozen in an eternal stasis, with the subject as form, on the one side, and an external content approaching me from outside, on the other. For such an inflexible and static separation is impossible. These elements can indeed be distinguished in every single piece of knowledge, but it is not possible for one element to be reduced to another once and for all. It follows that the distinction between subject and object is dynamic. It has the character of a process, but should not be made into an absolute, a fundamental structure of being any more than in the spirit of the critique of pure reason the concept of being may be posited as such a basic structure. Subject and object, this distinction is not given for all time. It enters into history and is therefore capable of being historically determined in its various phases. I believe that, if you have followed me thus far, I shall have furnished you with the crucial tools for the transition from the critique of pure reason to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, which contains the idea that the subject-object problem should be treated so as to ensure that these two elements do not oppose each other in a static, inflexible manner. Instead, the element of reciprocal mediation between them that I have tried to isolate immanently in Kant is now interpreted historically. That is to say, the relation between subject and object is equated by Hegel with history itself. Conversely, history is interpreted by him as the determination of subject and object, but in a way that distances them fundamentally from their general definition as constant, unchanging entities. Hegel, of course, remained an extreme idealist. In consequence, this movement, this historical movement between subject and object, was only possible for him because both elements flowed into a third one, namely into the absolute, the idea, so that finally they are first elevated and then reconciled in identity. This need not concern us here, nor need we be concerned at present with the criticism these ideas have attracted. At any rate, this transition from the antithesis between subject and object that prevailed in philosophy from Descartes to Kant to a dynamic relationship between subject and object is the decisive step taken by philosophy in that period. In this connection, I cannot resist drawing your attention to what I regard as a peculiar regression in philosophy today. We need only see how people today restrict the scope of philosophy and consider the emotional reaction that a philosophy attracts if it refuses to be confined in this way. On the one hand, you have a conception of philosophy that limits it to the realm of the abstract in precisely the sense we have been defining with respect to Kant. On the other hand, it is easy to see how such a view of philosophy is resisted by a work like the Phenomenology of Spirit. In that work there is a constant interaction between the categories of consciousness, the positioning of the subject and the objective events of history, such as the feudal system, master-servant relations and above all the French Revolution. Thus these very real historical processes are in continuous engagement with the problems of constitution. Now it is hard to avoid the thought that according to the view that prevails today, this Hegelian philosophy would not be thought of as philosophy at all. We might say that philosophy today has relapsed to the pre-Hegelian, Kantian standpoint. More specifically, Kant's allergic reaction towards the empirical, and indeed towards everything that stands in opposition to pure essence, a reaction that was banished and exorcised in the great systems that came after Kant. That allergy has reappeared in full force again today, as a complement to the advances in the positive sciences. The more there is of mere factuality, mere science, on the one side, the more philosophy is reduced simply to a doctrine of abstract essences on the other, and even the concept of history is diluted to that of historicality. Point 1. The decisive point here, the point I want most to emphasize in these lectures, is that the element of mediation between these two areas of interest, what Fichte meant when he said magnificently that the a priori and the a posteriori are the same thing, 6, has vanished entirely from the purview of philosophy today. While philosophy imagines that it is streets ahead of so-called idealism, it has in fact fallen behind the subsequent advances, and without noticing it has lapsed into a full-blooded and extremely crude idealism. This may enable you to understand why in my remarks on the implications of Kant's philosophy I am adopting such a critical view of his ontological interpreters 7, and of the concept of ontology itself. I should emphasize, however, that in doing so I remain on Kantian terrain, since the impossibility of ontology is among the explicit tenets of the critique of pure reason. In other words, even though the distinction between subject and object emerges in the critique of pure reason with a somewhat unsettling bluntness, it is not possible to look behind it in search of a primordial unity that would bring the two together. Having explained to you the problem of this rigid opposition of subject and object, form and content, form and matter, or however it may be termed in Kant, the temptation to regress to some prior stage becomes very pressing. The need to dissolve this rigid opposition lies in the fact that it involves an unsatisfactory and rigid separation of elements, while at the same time we are constantly being compelled to recognize that one cannot exist without the other. That is to say that each is so defined as to be constantly referring to the other. The decisive factor here, and one that is always being overlooked in the case of Hegel and the dialectic, is that by seeking to transcend this Kantian dualism, and by failing to do so, you regress to an earlier stage and relapse into sheer immediacy. The only escape route from this impasse is the one we have been trying out here in a modest way, and that is to transcend it by advancing through this dualism, that is to say, by demonstrating that what is divided is itself mediated. In other words, then, the answer is to search for a so-called unity prior to this disintegrating duality. Kant himself repeatedly called for such a unity, whether secret or concealed, whether it was to be found in the depths of the soul or in the transcendent thing in itself. Instead, what has to be done is to hold fast to this differentiation, and that is what I meant earlier on by the determinate nature of subject and object. What has to be done is to hold fast to this ineluctable duality, a duality that cannot be ignored and that recurs in concrete form at every stage of history, but at the same time, within this state of differentiation, to define the element of unity as its other. This is what philosophies fail to do when they imagine that they can eliminate the antinomies, the unsatisfactory nature of mere antitheses, by the arbitrary assumption of an underlying unity. This has the further consequence of enabling philosophy resolutely and finally to emancipate itself from the very thing that is demanded of it today, to wit, a concern with the highest abstractions. Thanks to the combination of present-day ontological trends with so-called philosophical anthropology, it is often claimed today that categories such as states of mind that commonly emerge from such schools of thought are not abstract but concrete in the highest degree. But such claims are quite specious. It can be shown that wherever such concrete specificities are claimed, they involve a sleight of hand in reality. Kant would say a psychological sleight of hand, and that they have been illicitly given the status of the highest abstractions with which this philosophy can alone be concerned. Once we have reached the point of admitting that in a very important sense philosophy is related to the concrete events of history, this must lead us back to the problems of society, which is where we started when we launched into the whole analysis. We are concerned with that present, that is to say, when we began our discussion of the Kantian use of we, a term we took so seriously because it was irreplaceable. The argument we are considering here, and which is advanced to counter the objections we have made, an argument which Kant would probably have endorsed in preference to the points we have made, this argument claims that what philosophy wants above all is to prepare the ground for being, and that if we wish to place it in an essential relation to society, that is, a constitutive relation rather than one based on analogy, we will be turning it into just such a piece of factual reality which it is the task of philosophy to ground, to illuminate. In consequence, we end up putting the cart before the horse. In reply, I would begin by reminding you that this line of argument itself depends on that very philosophy of origins, the quest for an absolute first principle, that we have been criticizing. We had come to the conclusion that this quest could not be sustained. In the pre-fascist era in which he experienced his philosophical prime, Martin Heidegger once described sociology as a cat burglar in contrast to philosophy. It clambers around on the outside of the building of philosophy, stealing whatever the honest philosophical craftsmen are building and growing, or it may have been farmers or whatever he may have had in his mind. Point 9. Of course, for Heidegger to speak in this way implies a certain defensiveness. The substance of that defensiveness is precisely that rigid antithesis between the validity of the truth and its genesis, its origins. For our part, we have come to the opposite conclusion, and I would remind you here of our discussion of the concept of function and of doing, or spontaneous action. 10. Our conclusion there was that this separation of genesis and validity was no absolute either, but that genesis dwells in the heart of validity. In other words, we decided that origins, the historical moment as I have called it today, are immanent in truth and, as I like to express it, the truth is not present in history, but history in the truth. 11. Heidegger's defensiveness is easy to understand. It is no accident. No more is the note of denunciation it contains a mere accident. Consider the arbitrary nature of such existential categories as anticipating death. Why exactly should anticipating death be a category constitutive of existence? Trownness or resoluteness, 1 to all of them categories taken from psychology and transposed into the transcendental. We find all such categories beguiling. We are tempted to cling to them dogmatically whenever anyone starts to scrutinize their arbitrary nature. They are based on assumptions that are merely asserted rather than something that emerges from the nature of the thing itself. This is best done by denigrating the intention underlying such scrutiny, as if the critic really desired to dissolve the concept of truth itself. Whereas in reality the opposite is the case, The aim is to overcome that age-old delusion according to which truth is identified with the permanent, immutable, identical, while the genetic, the emerging, whatever has not always existed, are classified as the untruth from the outset. The idea of Genesis is intolerable in these philosophies because the things they defend have cause to fear reflection on their origins. However, we have demonstrated, and I attach the very greatest importance to this, that this genetic factor cannot be isolated from the question of validity. This means that we have shown that what are alleged to be the most highly abstract and universal factors governing knowledge, the factors that must be present for knowledge to be conceived of in the first place, presuppose the element of factuality, of actual existence, that they are supposed to explain. Thus reflection on the fact that subject and object or transcendental factors and human reality are mutually interdependent is at the same time a necessary pointer to the fact that I must not make absolutes of these transcendental factors, I may not hypostatize them. This means that I may not separate them from their genesis, their origins in factual reality, any more than I can detach factual reality or judgments about the world of things from their subjective mediation and hence from their historical roots. In this sense, therefore, the studies we have undertaken, the ideas we have brought to the surface in Kant through our interpretations, are directly suited to nullify the kind of separation of genesis and validity that was first introduced into philosophy by Franz Brentano in his book The Origin of Our Knowledge of Right and Wrong, 13, which was based on certain scholastic traditions, and was subsequently developed formally by Husserl. 14. This trend culminated in the emergence of fundamental ontology. In other words, the transition from the so-called problem of constitution in Kant to history was already implicit in Kant himself. The process of constitution was actually implemented for him by time. I would remind you here of the role of memory in Kant, and if that is so, you have a strong pointer to history. For it is not possible to speak of time in the absence of some inner intuition, something inwardly present that experiences time in itself, and in this recourse to something that possesses time the historical is necessarily implied. It is an arbitrary act to stop short at the experiential time of individual human beings who happen to form the point of departure for philosophy, but then to refuse to take this recourse to time seriously. To take it seriously would mean fully appreciating the historical origin of our categories. On the other hand, however, and I should like to stress this as one of the most important findings of our Kant analyses, we are no less critical of a really misguided sociologism than we are of these ontologizing interpretations of Kant and their resultant ontologies. We are saying, then, that just as it is impossible to see the categories other than in relation to their origin and to history, it is equally impossible simply to derive concepts like space, time and the categories from history and to reduce them to social phenomena. I use the term sociologism with some hesitation because in their polemics against sociologism you often hear pharisaical overtones creeping in on the part of critics who imagine that they have a permanent monopoly on sacred goods and are convinced that they have to defend them against relativism. But on the other hand, and I believe that I can say this without fear of being thought old-fashioned and stuffy, it goes without saying that there is, of course, a kind of sociologism that has dissipated its own enlightened impulses in the sense that it has ceased to acknowledge any concept of truth at all and thus finds itself in conflict with its own intentions. In particular, I have in mind here comments that are relevant in the context of our discussion of the historical dimension of philosophical explanation. That is to say, I am thinking of the sociology of knowledge, which in the German tradition is generally regarded as the domain of Schiller and Mannheim, although in reality our greatest debt in the field of the sociology of knowledge is owed to Emil Durkheim. Durkheim made a serious attempt to give a sociological explanation of space, time and a series of categories and above all, the forms of logical classification. For example, he derived temporal relations from the sequence of the generations and thus described them as something entirely social in origin. 15 Durkheim's account is just as antinomic as Kant's, whose antinomies I have described to you during the past few lectures with reference to the concept of universality. As something detached from the particular human subject. I cannot go into these questions here, but I owe it to you at least to indicate the crucial points so as to secure what I have just said against the misunderstanding that I am myself guilty of sociologism. Durkheim's mistake can be easily summarized. His account of historical origins, for example, of time and space, constantly employs concepts that already presuppose the forms of intuition, to use a Kantian terminology, of time and space. For example, it is not possible to talk of a sequence of generations if you have no conception of events succeeding one another in time. And if you assert that people have arrived at the idea of space from the way fields are separated off from one another, from individual properties bordering upon one another, then you evidently presuppose the concept of space, since this idea of properties bordering one another can only have a spatial meaning. But if sociologism is really doomed to failure at this its most radical point, the point where it has really tried its hardest, then the entire enterprise must be extremely problematic. My view would be that the objectivity of time, which appears in Kant as a transcendental condition, a pure form of intuition, should be separated from reflections on time or the creation of a concept of time. The creation of a concept of time, and by analogy, of course, the same thing holds good for the concept of space, is something that takes place within history and depends, therefore, on social conditions. It is precisely at this point that we can see that the research of the later Durkheim school has been so extraordinarily productive. I am thinking here of the work of Henry Hubert and Marcel Mauss. But, naturally, there can be no question of dissolving space and time into their social roots or suggesting that they are simply things posited by society and not, if I may use the medieval expression, concepts that also have their fundamentum in re. On the other hand, however, we must repeat that without subjectivity, and that means, without real subjects interacting with one another, all talk of an objective concept of time as a concept that has priority over the consciousness of time, would be meaningless. Instead, the truth is that these two concepts are mutually interdependent. Lecture 16, July 1, 14959 Society Block. Last time I attempted to show you that our reflections on the relations between constituents and constitutum and the connections we established between them and the Kantian we, which we saw